Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. Today I have a fun little beginner technique, and this is embossed resist two different ways. So to start off with, I'll be using these stamps today for both of my cards. These are both from Crackerbox and Susie Stamps. Everything I'm using, as always, will be listed down in the description box below. So the first thing you want to do with your embossed resist technique is get your cardstock ready. Now the first card I will be using inks for my embossed resist, so I'll be using white cardstock. I also want to prep my surface with my embossing bag to reduce any static, and that is just going to help the embossing powder stick to where it is only supposed to. Now, I want to go ahead and with that cardstock in my MISTI, I'll place my stamps and line them up on my cardstock. This is a mini MISTI. It's a stamp positioner. It really helps with lining up my stamps properly, getting a really good impression. I can stamp more than one stamp at one time, and also it's going to help me later on in this technique when I want to do a couple layers of embossing powder. If you don't have one of these, you can use just a regular acrylic block with your rubber stamps as well. For my stamping today, I'll be using my Versamark ink pad. This is a clear, sticky ink that is great for holding on to your embossing powder once you stamp it. It's going to be a little bit hard to see, especially in the video, but once you get it stamped on, it's just this nice, clear, sticky layer where once you pour the embossing powder over, it will hold on to that powder and nowhere else on the cardstock will it stick, especially since we've used that embossing powder to resist the areas where this ink won't be. So I've inked up my stamp really well with my Versamark ink pad, and I'll just flip over the lid of my MISTI and stamp it directly on top of my cardstock. I'm giving this some good pressure, making sure I get all of those areas since I am using such a large stamp with a lot of detail, and also I'm using more than one stamp. Now, I want to go ahead and make sure that I got all of the area of this stamped. So I'm using my MISTI. I can go ahead and double stamp this. That's another bonus of using a stamp positioner like this with the hinge lid. That way you can double stamp. You know you're going to get a good impression and you're not going to miss any of those areas. So I'm giving this some good pressure once more, and then I can go ahead and pull this out, and it's time to put on our embossing powder. For my embossing powder today, I'll be using the Imagine Emboss embossing powders, and this is silver. This is a really, really nice embossing powder, and it comes in a bag, which I love. However, the majority of your embossing powders you're going to find come in jars like this. Now, another brand that I like are the Ranger embossing powders. A lot of different brands you can find out there. I'm using the Imagine Emboss though for mine today. It's just what I like. So now I'll go ahead and place some of this embossing powder right on top of my cardstock where my stamped image is. Now, when I first learned how to emboss and I was watching videos on it, I remember thinking, why are they using so much powder? That is such a waste. Don't worry about it. Once you get it on your stamped image, you dust it off onto a piece of scrap paper that's underneath. You can also use a paintbrush that can just kind of dust away any of the little extra pieces that are left on there, because anywhere that this is on your cardstock, it's going to resist the ink that we put over the top of it. So make sure you get all those little stray powders off, and a very small fine detail paintbrush comes in super handy for that. I also like to give it some really good taps on the back, and that just knocks off any of that extra powder so you don't have any major clumpage or you don't have all those little extra stray powders as well. Now, going back to when you dust this off onto your scrap piece of paper, all you do then is fold your paper in half and just transfer it right back into the container. Any powder that didn't stick to your image can be reused over and over and over again until it sticks to your image. So once I have that done, it's time to go ahead and start heat setting. I let my heat gun heat up for about a minute, and then I bring it to my cardstock so it's nice and hot. It's going to prevent some of the warping that can happen when you do heat setting. Now, this is always so fun to me. I love heat embossing. I love watching the magic happen when it melts down. It still amazes me to this day. that I can produce something handmade that looks like this. So I'll just move my heat tool around, make sure I get it good and heat set, and then once one portion is heat set, I'll continue to move my heat gun on to another portion. You do not want to hold your heat gun over something that has already been heat set. The first thing it's going to do is lose its shine. It's going to lose that little bit of a raised dimension. Once it loses that raised dimension and its shine, then it's going to burn. It happens very quickly. So once it's set and it melts down and you've got that shine, move on. Don't hold it over one spot. Once it's burnt, you can't go back. And once it loses its shine, even if you stop there, you still have a dull piece in your embossing. So once it gets its shine, its nice flat surface, move on and continue heat setting across your cardstock. Now, because I use my Misty again, I'm going to go ahead and do a double stamping on this. I will show you the difference between one layer of embossing powder and 2 layers. It really does make quite a difference. It's something I love to do, especially on sentiments, or if I'm embossing over a die cut, something like that. I like to add more than one layer. It really evens it out, creates a nice solid surface to work with. So I went ahead and just placed my panel right back into my Misty, inked it up. I did prep my surface again, inked it up. Then I can come in, stamp over the top of it just like I did before, and apply my embossing powder again, same as I did before. And you'll see, because I use my Misty and my stamp positioner, that this is going to lay exactly over the top of my previously stamped image. As long as you tuck it really securely into that corner, you're going to get a perfect impression over the top of it each and every time. Now, once I have that embossing powder spread on, I'll dust the excess off and use my paintbrush to get rid of any little extra stray pieces before I come in and heat set it with my heat tool. This is, again, super easy. Just keep moving it. Once it's heat set, move on to the next piece. Don't hold it over any one spot too long. And there you can see it is nice and smooth and shiny. That extra layer just adds a little bit more dimension and it really smooths it out. Here you can see the real difference between the 2 times of heat setting or embossing over the top of each other. I wanted to create a bit of a scene with this tree image that I stamped down. So in order to do that, I want to create a snowbank. Now, I have done a video on a ton of different ways you can add snow to your scenes. That's especially helpful during this time of year. It's already started to snow here in Iowa, so lucky us. Anyway, I wanted to go ahead and create some snowbanks on my card. In order to do that, I'm just going to use white space to give the illusion of that. And I'll do a little bit of masking in order to create that white space. I like to use painter's tape, and to create that hill, I just use my craft knife. Now it's time to start ink blending over the top of our embossing. Now I'll be using Catherine Pooler's ink. I like to use dye inks for this, and you can use a bunch of different products to get the ink on the paper. I'm using my Amazon blending brushes. You can use sponge daubers, whatever you want to use and you're comfortable with. I will leave a video all about ink blending down in the description box below. Now, when you start to ink blend over this tree or any embossed image, it's going to resist that ink. The embossing kind of seals in that layer of cardstock and it creates a nice shiny surface that resists anything wet you put over the top of it. I'm using different inks to just create a really, really fun sort of night sky look. And then once that's all on, I can go ahead and remove that painter's tape from my little snowbank that I created. And then it's time to kind of buff off any ink that's left over on top of that embossing. It will create a little bit of a film. And I noticed with this one, it did change the color of the embossing a little bit. Sometimes it's going to do that. It's just going to be about experimenting with the different inks, the ink colors, and how they react with the embossing powders you have. This one, it created almost a tarnished silver look, so you can really see the difference between the top of the tree and where that line was protecting the bottom of it. Just creates a more dull tarnished look, but I love the way it turned out. If you don't like the way that looks, make sure you experiment before you start on your actual project. You can also see a little bit of the change just by or on the sentiment as well. But to finish this card off, I kept it really, really simple. I just matted that panel with the black piece of cardstock and adhered everything to an A2 side folding card base that I used horizontally. So super simple and easy to do. And now let's move on to the next one, which is with watercolor. So I like the results of this one better. However, you do have a little bit more time involved in this one. You have to have a little bit of dry time, and you do need watercolor paper for this one. So I'm using the Arteza watercolor paper. It has a textured side. You can see my daughter drew on it, but I'm going to use the smooth side, so that's okay. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and put this into my MISTI. I've left this stamp, the tree stamp, exactly where it was before. I did, however, remove this sentiment because I'll be using a different ink to stamp that down later on once I get the watercolor on the paper. I'll be using same thing as before. Prep my surface with my embossing bag. Did a really good job of that to make sure that no stray embossing powder will go where I don't want it. Another reason you don't want that stray embossing powder where you don't want it, it not only just looks a little messy, but anywhere it is, it's going to resist the ink. So you'll end up with little speckles if you leave those on your paper. So use your embossing bag beforehand. I do want to mention too, I just remembered I have a video on when you do use it and when you don't use it, the different results. I'll leave that link down below as well. I stamped down that tree a couple times. That is especially important with this. Even using the smooth side of your watercolor paper, it can still be a little textured. So I like to double stamp on this as well. And for this, I'm using white embossing powder. Now this can get a little tricky because it is white on white. It's a little hard to see. It's a good thing that the watercolor paper is just a tad bit off-white. You can see it a little bit better than you can on regular cardstock. But once I get that on there, I'll use my dry paintbrush just to remove any stray little flecks of embossing powder, and then I can heat set once more. Again, I like to let mine heat up for about a minute and then bring it to the paper and start heat setting. And then when you let it heat up, things start to move quickly and just continue to move to a new spot once the other spot has melted down. White embossing powder is super easy to burn. Ask me how I know. So just continue to move that heat gun around. Now for this, I am again going to use that same technique of just cutting painter's tape with my craft knife to create that snowbank look that I'm going for. And I'll use that painter's tape to mask off the bottom portion of this card. That white space is just a great way to create the illusion of a snowbank there on your card without any extra work. And the painter's tape is a really good way to mask off your area also when you're doing watercolor. I will be watercoloring on my hardboard. I'll leave this linked in the description box as well. It is so great to use this. When you're watercoloring, it keeps the paper from really curling up and warping on you, especially when using a lot of watercolor. You can tape it right down to its surface like I'm doing here. And also, it lets you move the watercolor around without touching the panel. So you can pick up the sides of this and move it around. You can also heat set on this. So it is heat resistant and you can heat set on this and it's not going to burn. I'm going to begin by really kind of getting my paper prepped with a lot of water on the background to get those fibers wet. I am using the Arteza brushes here. These are water brushes. All you do is fill them up with water and then the water comes through the bristles. There have been some brands of these I haven't had good luck with. I felt like they just released too much water or I couldn't get the water to come out at all. I really like this Arteza set and it has quite a few in there that you really get a good nice array of different tips on there. But I use the flat brush for this just to get the paper wet. Now once I have the paper wet, I let the water absorb into there and then I'm using my Arteza. These are the real brush markers and I'm just going to start scribbling on color. I started with the darkest towards the bottom, towards the snowbank that I created, and then I'm going one step lighter. I had 3 colors out, but I only used 2 because this is such a small surface area. I can just use my water brush to blend that out and create so many different tones just by blending it out and adding more water as I pull this up to the top of the paper. And all I'm doing is adding just the tiniest bit of water and then pulling it up, going side to side, and pulling that color up to the top of the cardstock. Now, as you can see, that wherever that tree stamp is and that embossing powder is, it resists the watercolor that's going onto the paper. So super simple and easy to do. Now you will notice a buildup of the watercolor on top of the tree. That's okay. Once it's dry, we can buff that away with a dry cloth. I wanted to add a little shine to this, so I'm using my sheer shimmer spritz. While this is still wet, I'm just going to give this a nice little spray. This is the Sparkle Sheer Shimmer Spritz. One of my favorite sparkly spritzes to put on top. It just creates a nice shimmer. You can't really see it while it's wet, but there's a nice close-up once it's dry. It just catches the light and is really, really gorgeous. Now, once I'm done with my background, you can set it aside to dry. And that's going to be your best option, or you can be super duper careful and use your heat tool, but not close, because if you reactivate that embossing powder, it's going to trap the color that's stuck on top of it, and it'll start to absorb that and turn a little bluish shade. So be super careful if you want to speed up your drying. Once it's dry, you can take a cloth and buff away that blue that is trapped on top of the embossing powder, and it just wipes right away, and then you've got your nice white embossed area once again. This is my favorite part, removing the masking from around the edges and that snowbank. I love to see the clean lines. You will notice sometimes that you have a little buildup of your watercolor on your painter's tape. Just use a cloth and remove that before you try and take the tape off. You don't want it to kind of smear or end up dripping onto your really nice stark white areas. Whenever you're removing the painter's tape, pull it straight back on itself and you shouldn't have any problem. If you start to notice tearing, move to the opposite side. And there's a closer look at that all finished, and now it's ready for the sentiment. I'm using the same sentiment as before in the exact same spot. The only difference is I'll be using VersaFine Clear and Nocturne. This is a pigment ink. If you want to use a dye ink here, you need to be careful that your watercolor is dry. If you go in and you stamp a dye ink on top of something that is wet, it will bleed. So just be careful that it's nice and dry if you don't have a pigment ink to stamp on top of it. VersaFine Clear Nocturne is a good one. You can also just use the old tried and true VersaFine Onyx Black ink. That works really well as well. So there's a closer look at the sentiment on that. I love, love, love. I think the watercolor one is my favorite. I love the way they both turned out. I just wasn't expecting that tarnished look from the ink beforehand. So again, make sure you test it out before you bring it to your card, your finished project. All I did with this one was glue that panel onto a card base that is A2 in size and side folding horizontally, and that was it. Super simple and easy for both of these cards. I hope that gave you a good idea of what the Emboss Resist technique is all about and how you can do it yourself as well. That is going to do it for me today. Don't forget all the information and more videos down in the description box below. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe as well. Thanks for watching and happy crafting, everyone.